You guys all like that song, Talking Heads? Anybody who doesn't know who the Talking Heads are, you should probably look that up. Listen to them immediately. So hi, thank you so much for being here and for welcoming me into your community. This is my first time speaking at a conference of this nature, so I'm really excited to convert some of you to information architecture. That is the only dad joke that will be included in my presentation. So I want to talk to you today about messes. I love making sense of messes. I do. Most people do not. They see a mess and they're like, ugh, just hide it, or like that's above my pay grade to deal with, whatever their excuse may be. They're not comfortable dealing with messes. That's generally when they hire someone like me. I am a professional information architect, so I make sense of other people's messes all day long. So I want to show you some pictures of some of the messes that I have tackled most recently. Now, this is probably the obligatory designer is on the stage, bunch of Post-it notes in a pile shot. So I'm going to acknowledge that. But I also want to challenge you on what the role of these Post-it notes actually is. Because these Post-it notes are not just sticky pieces of paper. These are actually important cognitive tools. And these are the places where the people that I work with store their hopes and their fears and their nightmares and the things that keep them up at night about their business. So these Post-it notes are actually a really important tool for us to get literally on the same page about things. Now, the messes that I deal with have one thing in common. They vary in terms of industry and vertical and our goals, but the one thing they share is a material called information. So I want to talk to you a little bit about information today, because I think that thinking about information as a material is actually really hard. It's very different than the other materials that we're taught to think about. Materials like pixels or glass or brick. Those are all things that we can pick up and we can put down and we can manipulate in a really real way. Information is not like that. Information is a totally different kind of material. And I want to share with you an example that I think we can all relate to, cookies. Who likes cookies? Yeah? Okay, awesome. Me too. So information can actually be made not just from physical material, but from the lack of physical material. And this is where things start to get pretty philosophical pretty quickly. So I want to break it down using this bakery case. If we walk into a bakery and look at this stack of cookies next to this one singular cookie, we can make inferences, to Jared's point, about why there is an uneven stack. So how many of you think that there is a reason for this, that is, oatmeal raisin is less popular than chocolate? A few of you? Okay. How many of you think that this difference is because the chocolate cookies are less fresh than the oatmeal cookies? Okay, a few of you. So how would we know what is true? Now, as the purveyors of the bakery, we might know what the objective truth is, that the oatmeal raisin had been refreshed within the last couple minutes and that the chocolate had not, right? But as users of the bakery, we don't know these things. And what's in our head, that's the information part. The content is the same to the purveyor and to the user. We still have the same amount of cookies, we still have the same signs, the same plate, the same arrangement. But the information that we draw out of that is very different. So what that means is that information is not the same as content. And the most important thing to note about this is that as people who make experiences, we can't make information. Our users actually do that for us. Now, what this also means is that truth really has no place here. If my users walk away believing that the chocolate cookie is more popular than the oatmeal cookie, that's what they believe to be true. That is their reality. So this idea that we can sort of put information into people's brains the way that we'd like it to be just doesn't exist. That's a fallacy of what we do. So it's a really important thing for us to understand that the content we provide, mixed with the context that they're in and the data that they have access to from their past experiences, is what results in their information. It's very hard to plan for. So information architecture is how we arrange the parts to be understandable as a whole. It's how we arrange the content to make sure that the kind of information that we want in our users' heads is more likely to end up there. So three lessons that I have for you today are things that I hope that you can take back to work as soon as you get back and apply to whatever it is that you're trying to make sense of from an information standpoint. So the first is that language matters. And I know this is a really obvious statement to most people. But the problem that I see is that while it's an obvious statement, it's something that most organizations that I've worked with just don't focus on in any real and tangible way. They admit that they're in meetings where they say something and people from other departments have completely different understandings of those things. I was recently talking to an analytics person at an organization, and he told me that he has to spend upwards of an hour every single week just culling together the resources from different data sets because they have 5 different labels to them. And bringing them all together is not something that's ever been done automatically. That's an example of something where I say there are people where there should be pipes. Right? There's certain things about the language that stand in the way of the way that we talk to each other and the way that we understand each other. So I want you to think for a second about your organization. And to make the process of thinking about language a little bit more approachable, I want you to focus on nothing but the nouns. If you were to think about all the nouns in your organization, what would that arrangement of things look like? If you were to make some sort of association map like the one shown here of how those nouns relate to one another in terms of the way that users might actually perceive them, what duplicative sets might you find? This association map is from a company that I worked with last year that had 14 ways of referring to the word video. Now, if I gave any of you the assignment to come up with 14 ways in English to refer to the word video, you'd probably top out at like 5, maybe. Now, the reason that this became really important is because they were an organization that was only focused in English, but they were looking to translate to 5 other languages to reach an international audience. Imagine the heft of translating all 14 of those concepts into 5 different languages. And this was something that wasn't just in the product itself. This was actually everywhere within the organization, down to the scripts that people used in the 1-800 number in the call center. I found during my research with this company a script that was 10 pages long, indicating to a customer service rep the language to use to differentiate these different terms to somebody on the phone. Just imagine that, all that apologetics in written form, just so a customer service organization can function. So this just wasn't scalable. So what I see in a lot of cases is that we have these duplicative things that need to be sorted out. So once we have the nouns taken care of, we can start to look at the verbs. And we can kind of zoom in on each of those nouns and think, what are the actions that a user might associate with this object? And are we using duplicative language unnecessarily to communicate those things? And really what we're looking for here is the difference between a model change or a label change. There are certain times where we might have the same model with several different labels, right? If you think about the example of a doctor and patient website where they're sharing a lot of the content, but it needs to be written differently for those 2 different audiences. We could have the same model, but with different labels for those 2 specific cases. So what I am not saying is that you always go to one label per noun or verb. And I know that at least one person in this room is probably going to come up to me after and be like, but there's probably a case where you need 2. You are completely right. Please do not hear me wrong. I will keep talking about it for another 5 seconds, just so we're totally clear that I am not always about one label per noun or verb. There's many different instances where you see purposeful duplication of models under different labels for a reason of whatever your goal is. So the goal here is not to simplify your language necessarily. The goal is to know what you mean when you say what you say. The goal is to look at language as a shared asset within your organization and find ways to understand when that duplication is actually getting in the way of conversation. So I want to talk about the coolest, most awesome, sexiest document that you have never seen, which is a controlled vocabulary. How many of you have a controlled vocabulary in your organization? Crickets. Right? Like, this is my life, is telling organizations, you need a controlled vocabulary document, and then showing them to them and then being like, this is so exciting, oh my God, this is what we need. And then they try to do it and they're like, this is really hard. So controlled vocabulary documents are, in my opinion, the greatest thing since sliced bread or perhaps pockets. It's the way that we get on the same page about what we say to one another. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to have these discussions, but it's important. Because experiences are made of language. Language is the one thing that is shared across every single person and every single system working on your organization's business. And so it's really important for us to understand that it's a shared asset. It's not something that some one person can own and document and put into an intranet page somewhere to be forgotten. So I really encourage you to talk about the language in your organization. Have those hard semantic arguments with your colleagues. Find out where the differences of opinion about what things are and what things are called reside, and then start to untangle those messes. And you'll see very quickly that there are a lot of them in a typical organization. So our second lesson is there is no right way. I wish that when a client called me, I could drive to the Taxonomy store and pick up an out-of-the-box solution and give it to them, and then just sit around while somebody implements it. That would be great, but that doesn't actually exist. Every time we're coming up with the structure of something or the set of labels and rules for something, there's going to be a unique configuration for that particular context. And furthermore, in most contexts, taxonomy is a tool of rhetoric and not an exact science. If we were to look at a broad swath of grocery store websites and grocery delivery services, like Fresh Direct or Walmart Grocery, what we would see is that the classification they've given to their products has absolutely nothing to do with scientific classification of things like plant life. In fact, here's a screenshot from Fresh Direct of their vegetable and fruit categories, and I've marked for you all of the things that I can assure you from a scientific standpoint are not vegetables. This doesn't mean it's wrong. This means that it's smart. They know that if they put their tomatoes and squash and eggplants under fruit, where scientists believe them to be, no one would be able to find anything. The conversion on tomatoes would go down quite dramatically. So what this means is that the way that you choose to organize your produce actually says something about who you are as an organization. If we were, say, making a website to teach children about the classification of plant life, we wouldn't make that same case and organize things that way. We might have the exact same findings from our user research. We might find that children believe tomatoes and eggplants and squash to be vegetables, not fruit. But to put them into an organization that had it that way, when our goal is teaching them about classification from science's standpoint, would be wrong. So it's not necessarily what the users want, it's what we need to get out of the experience for them. So this means that there is no right way to organize something. There's only the way that matters in terms of reaching your goals. So the only way that we can know if it's right is to measure. So if none of you have done something called a card sort before, has anybody done a card sort? A couple of you? Awesome. Sweet. So this is something that we can use to get at the heart of this problem. This is when we write down all of the things that we want to organize, and we give it to our users to organize it for us. And by watching several users go through that exercise, we'll be able to see what they believe to be true about those things. One of the best ways to kind of get over the hump of organizing things in a new and different way is to actually show an alternative way of organizing something. So sometimes when you've worked in an organization for a while, you start to realize that everybody's sort of like, yeah, but we've always done it this way. And when we get into those circumstances of we've always done it this way, it's really hard to break out and do something different. So I encourage you to be the one that can actually show that alternative way. Organize it by something completely wacky. Take your produce and organize it by color. I can assure you that that doesn't actually work in practice in most cases, because many produce come in many colors. My students came up against that challenge very quickly in that exercise. But doing those exercises breaks us out of that model of always doing things the exact same way. And our last lesson is we need pictures. So this is another very obvious statement that I don't see enough people putting into practice. When you are in a meeting with somebody and they are using their hands a lot, they are drawing a picture in their brain. It should be your job to get it out of them, to get it onto a whiteboard or a piece of paper or a sketch file or whatever, right? Those pictures are important kind of touch points for us to get on the same page with each other. And if we don't have a picture, we are literally walking away with different pictures in our heads. So it's really important that we create that kind of shared vision of what something is. And once we have it as an actual picture, we can start to have deeper conversations about it. So I have a couple of kind of lessons learned, if you will, on making pictures. The first is to take the time and space that's needed to collect and iterate on those pictures. Now, this is a really interesting story from a few years ago. I was doing some work with the team at Nike, and they had this process, this 96-week process. Now, just imagine that, 96 weeks to do something that results in a pair of shoes on your feet. I'm sure there's some Nike sneakers in this room today. Those sneakers took 96 weeks from idea generation to on your feet in the store, which is kind of amazing. Now, the more amazing part was no one had ever seen a picture of the 96-week process. If you asked one person at Nike to describe the process end to end, no one could do it. Everyone owned one siloed part of that process. Now, what happened out of that was that they had, over time, thought, hey, you know what would really help us? Technology. So what did they do? They went out and they got vendors and they got engineers to build them tools that would help with their part of the process. Now, as people who are concerned with data, you can probably start to project what the problems with that are. They're basically only using their data for their one little part of things. And over time, management realized that the use of that data in a more standard, all the way through the process way, would be the way that they would be able to actually implement these tools in a more useful way for people working there. So what did they do? They hired a vendor to build them a single platform, right? And at the beginning of this project, they were looking at 24 disparate business applications across more than 10,000 internal users. And all of those internal users had their own preferences that had led to the creation of these 24 different processes. So the point of this in telling you is that I could not go into one single workshop and get all of that information out of all of those people. I needed time and I needed space to actually go through that piece by piece. And in a lot of cases, when we get the opportunity to work on something like that, it's very tempting to kind of run for the finish line. Be like, I want to make a picture of this process, so let me do it based on what I know right now, and then we can edit from there. The problem with that is that you end up documenting the wrong things. So this is a picture from a war room in Portland, Oregon that I kept for 3 months at Nike. And every single meeting I had with different people and different groups from different functions along that 96-week process. And we were able to iterate on this in a really slow and methodical, albeit boring process. I mean, I was bored to tears by the end of this. But it was super engaging in terms of its ability to be correct, right? So I want to show you the picture of the thing that came out of it, because you can't leave it on the wall forever. And this is like, ooh, it's so simple. You visualize something hard to explain. Good job, Abby. There's never been a picture of this 96-week process. You are the best. This is amazing. Oh my God, you guys see where this story is going, right? This was really, really bad. Now, the reason that this did not work out for me is because I had simplified it too much. I had taken what was a 96-week process full of all sorts of dependencies and complex business logic relationships, and I had reduced it into something that made it seem like it could have been a wizard, right? Like, welcome to week 1. In week 1, you have to deal with exactly 3 orange balls, right? This is not the reality of the process. So the reason that I actually realized, because everybody loved this diagram, they thought it was so great. You could finally see a 96-week process that they all kind of had versions of in their head. The reason that I had to retract this document was because it started to lead to the wrong design considerations. The team that was working on the single sign-on platform in support of this process started to explore concepts that were very much, welcome to week 1, welcome to week 2. And they had based it on this inference that this was something that went in a logical order over the course of 96 weeks. But we all know that people are not going to have 96 weeks to do just one thing. They're working on a seasonal basis. So during that 96 weeks, they're actually dealing with the same process at different points, and it's all stepped on top of each other. So I republished a much scarier version of the diagram to inspire realistic instead of simplistic thinking. This was the message that I needed those engineers and designers to understand, is that this was something that we needed to have a system that actually supported that much dependency on top of each other. So the lesson of this is that we have to be really careful of reductionism, right? This is a schematic of a pizza. And if you know what pizza is, as I am assuming many of you do, then this makes a lot of sense. You're like, this looks like a pizza, doesn't taste like a pizza, it's not as colorful as a pizza, but it'll do. Now let's imagine that a space invader came from outer space, had never understood the concept of pizza before. And based on this diagram, we ask them to make us a pizza. We give them all the ingredients, we say, here you go, here's your diagram, go for it. Where are they gonna put the cheese in relation to the tomato sauce? Right? Are they gonna like put it all in a bowl and mix it up? I mean, that does not make for a delicious pizza. Are they gonna put the tomato sauce on top of the cheese like those weirdos in Chicago do? Like, what is with that, right? So the idea of giving something to someone that only has that surface level detail of how it all came together really leaves a lot to the imagination. Now I want you to think about how close this diagram of pizza is to the thing we call wireframes. We are leaving a lot of detail out. We are allowing people to make a lot of assumptions about how those pieces come together. So IKEA has done a really good job of using the exploded schematic version of the wireframe to show how the things come together. So we have to show not just the results, but also the process and how we get there. So diagrams are the best way for us to acknowledge complexity. And it's really important that our diagrams do just that. In a lot of cases, our diagrams are just simple presentations of our understanding of a topic. And we present them in a way that it's not meant to be critiqued and worked on at that deeper level. So instead, what we need to do is make diagrams that people feel like they can enact change on. We want those diagrams to be tools of collaboration and shared understanding. Because once we agree on things, we can get momentum on things. We've all been in that project that just won't move forward. I have seen diagrams be the gasoline in that vehicle. So I want to encourage all of you to be the ones that pick up the marker. Someone once told me that the person who picks up the marker owns the project. So own the project. And make a picture of the monster that's in everyone's head. Every one of your teammates is walking around with their own version of the thing that you're trying to battle. So why not be the person that can actually draw a picture of it and have everybody come around that picture and decide that it's actually not that scary and maybe we can move forward. So to start making sense of your mess, I think it's important that you talk about the language that's used in your organization. I think you can be the one that can show an alternative way of organizing something and make a picture of the monster that's in everyone's head. And the last thing that I want to ask you is kind of a favor. There's this thing called information architecture, and it's important to what all of you are doing in this room. It's also being practiced by a lot of other people in your organization. But the likelihood is no one's ever taught them that term before. So if you see information architecture, say it. Having a name for this concept is the only way that we're going to collectively get better at it. And information architecture is not just practiced by information architects. And with that, I would love to take some questions. Thank you. What do we got? What do we got?
Thank you so much. That was awesome. And we have some really good questions here.
Yeah.
So the first one here, should the controlled vocabularies guide sit inside the brand style guide, or is it something different?
That is a very good question. So I think that there's, I have some feels on that. So I've seen times when the controlled vocabulary becomes a part of the brand style guide and it gets reduced to only marketing terms. And sometimes those marketing terms are not actually going to that next level of depth to deal with the organizational complexity of actually working there. So I would say yes, and. I think that it has to have a place in the brand style guide because the vocabulary you're using in that style guide should match up with the larger controlled vocabulary. But also, I think it also needs to have like a bigger presence in other places. So if you have like a place that you go to for deciding what to call things in the technology layer, for example, that's a really important thing to be dealing with as well.
Thank you. How do you sell duplicative language problems to leadership so that they actually commit resources to solving it?
I'll be Jared Spool for a minute. money. You got to attach dollars to it in some cases. So with the company that had 14 terms for video, they had operated for a really long time at that. But when they figured out how much money it was going to cost to translate all of that and all of the like heft that that came with, it became a different conversation. So I would definitely say you need to be making the business case. And also, like, don't just go vigilante on your language because reasons. Like, you need to have an actual problem that you're trying to solve. So rather than go back to your organization and be like, we need a controlled vocabulary for everything, like, pick one little thing and be like, hey, so when you say this and you say this, I don't think we mean the same thing. Maybe we could, like, agree on what the differences are and decide on one way, or at least document why those are different.
And we have a great question here from Joanna Weave. Is the controlled vocabulary a living document? Who comes up with it? How do you decide on the words to use and the words to stop using?
Oh, I'm so glad that question got asked. So, controlled vocabulary is absolutely a living document, and the number one thing that I would recommend is that you never, ever, ever designate a czar of language. So I have been asked to be the czar of language in several instances, and you have to push back on that because the best controlled vocabularies are actually implemented by a cross-functional team. So what you want to do instead of having one person documenting it is you want to identify people in different roles throughout the organization and have them be part of that committee to help you to understand language. Because sometimes the way that we understand it over here is not the same as how it's understood here. So cross collaboration, and yes, definitely a living document.
Awesome. Well, those were the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.